consistent, in his Christian business practices. Interestingly, just toward the last year of his presidency, 1915, when he stepped down and became chairman, his annual report to shareholders, it came with the financial statements, to all the shareholders, began with this word: "The Lord has greatly blessed and prospered the business of Union Oil Company. Its motto has ever been pure goods, full measure, and a square deal." Coupled with the scripture admonition, "Acknowledge him, the Lord, in all thy ways, and he shall direct thy paths." So this was his MO. This was his unique character. And interestingly, whenever you find a Union Oil camp, established in the Central Valley, Santa Maria Valley, Ventura County, they always built a school, a church, housing, for the oil workers, and they had Union Oil chaplains that went out by wagon, to hold services on Sunday, and so there was this consistent, kind of religious ethic, with the Union Oil Company that was very distinctive. You may remember, if you saw the movie There Will Be Blood, which is this Hollywood characterization of the oil days, and these exact oil days. And the trailer for the movie says, "When ambition meets fate, there will be blood." And they've got this character, Daniel Plainview, who's like a fraud. He's a fake religious guy, who kind of fakes, being a good civic citizen. And he goes, town to town, telling them he's going to build a school and build a church, and families are going to live together, in this oil community. And I'm a family man. I'm an oil man. I'm one of you. That's the. In fact, the opening speech of that movie, it goes 15 minutes without a word. It's just all of this action. Holes being drilled. Grunting and breathing and digging holes deeper and deeper, and then the first speech of the whole movie is this speech, which is it's really a spoof, on Lyman Stewart. Question?
It's a spoof. It's not accurate, then, as far as.
Well, you see, in this screenplay was based on the book by Sinclair Lewis. Excuse me, I always get them confused. Upton Sinclair.
Yeah.
He wrote the novel Oil in 1927, which was a characterization of the oil industry, just like he had done in the book Jungle of the meatpacking industry in Chicago. And Upton Sinclair was a socialist, who hated capitalists, didn't like traditional family, values. Definitely didn't like religion. So he was always spoofing this, and creating caricatures. But it's a wonderful movie. I mean, it was great cinematography. Daniel Day-Lewis won an Oscar, for best acting, and I think best cinematography Oscar. And it was a very authentic view of the California oil fields.
Was he portrayed as someone of the group that you talked about, or does he have a specific? Does this gentleman represent a certain?
Plainview is a composite figure who's part Edward Doheny, who really did dig an oil well with a shovel, and a bit Lyman Stewart, who is this upright, civic character, setting up oil towns, and a few other corrupt people.
Not including Lyman.
No, Lyman was the real thing, but I'm just going to keep going and see if I can get the end. So they had this little success, this one oil well that they drilled in Pico Canyon. But they said, we got to get out from under the PCO, who's been screwing us, and let's go look for, other partners in other places. And John Irwin went by secretly, he left the Pico Canyon area because they were under contract with PCO to drill holes in their leases. They couldn't actually, they had to sneak away looking for other places. They came to Payru, Sespe, Torrey, Sini, and Ojai fields. This is where they run into Bard, in Ojai field. And they decide, let's just move, all our operations. Let's get a loan from the bank, keep our men, and they moved to Santa Paula. The Stewart family moved to Santa Paula and helped start a Presbyterian church there. The Hardison family moved to Santa Paula. Very interesting. The Hardison house here is on Ojai Road. I'd like to get in it sometime. I understand it's open to the public. He bought a lot of land. I think thinking, well, maybe oil's not going to turn out. Maybe I should, grow lemons, or walnuts, or ranching, or something. And he did. He formed the Santa Paula Horse and Cattle Company, and he imported 21 head of thoroughbred Holstein cows from Holland. Came around the Horn, to Hueneme Pier, and he brought them out to Santa Paula. Most of the dairy herd in Southern California, from that group of Holstein cows. And then they began partnering with Bard. Bard hasn't been doing oil, but he has land, and he has money. Okay, the land is worth a lot. They've been selling off a lot of land. And they decided to partner and form a couple of small companies, the Sespe Oil Company, SOC. They said, Bard, you can be president, you're a multimillionaire, and Hardison was the general manager. They split, the ownership. They formed a Torrey Canyon Oil Company. Again, Bard being the president, even though they owned, most of the stock. And Bard opened up the Ojai Rancho for exploration, and right away they began having some real serious success in the Ojai Rancho in Adams Canyon. A couple of very big, producers. So, the Bard partnership, really saved the day. They built a pipeline from Santa Paula here to Hueneme. They had a storage tanks about a mile from here, I understand. And then they had a gravity feeder line that ran to the pier. And here's a picture of them building it. 20-mile, 4-inch pipeline. So it's quite an undertaking. In the There Will Be Blood movie, there's actually a little scene, where Daniel Plainview, the main character, is sitting in a tavern trying to spy on a group of the PCO oilmen, who are there meeting with the Southern Pacific Railroad people. And they say, the Union Oil is building a pipeline from Santa Paula to the coast at Hueneme to ship crude by boat directly to San Francisco and Seattle. This would upset their monopoly, of railroad and oil. And so it's true, but they got it wrong. The Union Oil Company hadn't been started yet. And this meeting in the movie was supposed to be in 1905, but they actually built this in 1887. But Hollywood license. They make peace with the PCO once they build this pipeline. Because they have to get this oil up to refineries that the PCO has. And Hardison writes to Lyman Stewart in 1886 after heading up by steamer to San Francisco to meet with the PCO executives. He says, "We met the enemy, and I will let you judge whether they are ours or we theirs. Call it what you will, I believe the arrangement if carried out will be a good one. Now let us have peace and as cordial feeling as possible. Felton will pull with us in the future if I'm not greatly mistaken." And they did share some ownership joint ventures with the PCO. So for a while, they're moving forward. I'm almost done, okay? Bard's fortunes continue to bloom. You know, he's sitting on a lot of valuable real estate, and real estate values are booming. You know, the railroads, Santa Fe Railroad has come to LA, spurs from the Southern Pacific, you know, are coming into this area. Unfortunately, the Stewarts, who are trying to buy land for oil production, are having to buy it at a much higher cost, you know, and they're buying it from people like Bard, you know, who's made a lot of money on it. And so the Stewarts are heavily in debt, you know, borrowing money to buy oil leases, to spend more money drilling for oil, hoping that they get, you know, a success. So it's a high-risk venture for the Stewarts, not so for Bard. You know, he's sitting pretty secure, you know, in his situation. Hardison and Stewart struggled to stay afloat in 1888. They're deep in debt to bankers. They have a gusher, you know, and actually there's so much oil flowing out of Adams Canyon, it fills the whole Santa Clara River, you know, all the way to the ocean, if you can believe it, for like 5 months. I mean, it wasn't pure oil, but I mean, it was contaminated. Okay? And they move into, this is not Union Oil headquarters yet, it's the Mission Transfer Company headquarters in the Hardison and Stewart headquarters. They move into this brick building on Main Street, which is now the California Oil Museum. And they struggle to try and increase the demand for petroleum because, you know, kerosene for oil lamps, you know, is fine, but, you know, how much lubricant, you know, the railroads need and how much asphalt needs to be spread on roads, fuel, you know, is still not a reality. They were not using oil for fuel yet. Lyman Stewart was a real innovator here. He got the Santa Fe Railroad to actually install one of his fuel burners that he had devised to replace coal. You know, and they said, oh, it's going to explode, or you can't get the energy, you know, the coal gives us. But they had a successful run up the Cajon Pass. You know, within a year, the Santa Fe, you know, had converted their whole fleet to fuel burning, and the rest of the railroad industry followed. Marine was a different matter. It's a little bit riskier to have a boat explode, you know, and lose everyone on hand than a train, you know, engine blow up. So there were laws that prohibited explosive, flammable, you know, liquids from fueling marine, which was overly cautious because technologies had been developed that were making it safe for the most part. Marine vessels didn't really shift to fuel oil until the navies, the U.S. Navy and the British Navy shifted just before World War I. Both Churchill, who's Admiralty Secretary of the British Navy, and Theodore Roosevelt were instrumental in getting the navies shifted to fuel oil. You know, think about it. Up until that time, you know, you weren't burning fuel, you know, to run steam engines. You were still burning coal, and some were spraying oil on coal, you know, to kind of goose it up a little bit. But, so Stewart was a real pioneer here. He actually then built their own tanker, you know, from a schooner. You know, they chopped off the sails or the masts and inserted big steel tanks, you know, in the hold, and they built the first oil tanker on the Pacific coast, the W.L. Hardison. It was inaugurated right here at Hueneme, January 10th, 1889, and it was going to beat, you know, the Standard Oil, PCO, and Southern Pacific monopoly on transportation by shipping oil, you know, up to the refineries in San Francisco and Seattle. Unfortunately, within a year, they exploded at the port in Ventura. It wasn't the burner that exploded, but a worker who was unloading, a cargo in Ventura lowered a kerosene lantern, down into the hold, to see if it was empty. Well, it wasn't. And, but they had proved their point, and not only that, they had proved that you could operate a oil-fueled steamer, which it was oil-fueled, and that powered an electric generator that had electric lights, and it was quite advanced. And pretty soon, the local coastal marine traffic began to convert to fuel oil from coal. You talked about a tunnel. Here's a tunnel for oil where they had taken one of the old Stanford tunnels and expanded it to try and get access deeper, to seams of oil, which was fairly successful. I mean, they continued, to extract oil through this tunneling method. But unfortunately, Harvey Hardison, who was their right-hand guy, the chief drilling supervisor, went deep into a tunnel after there was an earlier explosion to investigate. And they were very careful because they used electric wires, for lights, into the tunnel to make sure that methane gas or other flammables wouldn't ignite. But, and they used mirror, to collect light from the sun and shine it down into the tunnel so that the whole tunnel was illuminated by a mirrored, light. But despite those precautions, Harvey Hardison and two others were killed in an explosion. And so these setbacks, the loss of the oil tanker, they had some bad luck drilling for a while. They had Hardison die. They were struggling now, and they began seeing, now what do we do to go to the next level? Do we need to merge, with a Eastern Syndicate, or what? And here, this is where, out of necessity, they agreed to combine with Bard and form the Union Oil Company. So this is what brought Hardison, Bard together. They decided to bring their three separate companies that they had jointly owned together into a holding company, which Hardison and Stewart actually owned more of the stock, but they decided, to favor Bard by naming him as president, and giving him some control over some of the divisions. They thought that they were getting along with Bard, pretty well, and he'd been very helpful. Well, so here's the beginning of the Union Oil Company. I'll try and wrap it up here, because this is the ending point that I wanted to get to. The agreement was Bard was named president. The understanding was Stewart would actually run the oil business. There would be 9 Union Oil directors. Initially, 5 of them Stewart, Hardison directors, 4 Bard, but they'd agree to get along. Unfortunately, they were men of different temperaments. They were very different in terms of what strengths they had. In some ways, you could say that would be a compliment. Here's the Unical history commenting on this. They said, Bard had property, influence in banking circles and politics, and a solid reputation as a business leader in the Ventura area. Stewart had imagination, nerve, and unmatched skill and experience as an oilman. But there were deep differences between the men that would ultimately lead to the rupture of their business relationship. And for the next 10 years, the two sides struggled, over control of what Stewart called, we are a house divided. And coming right after the Civil War, that meant, this is going to end in some victory of one side or the other, not peace. Bard didn't like Hardison. He didn't like his style. He didn't like his cut. He was heavily in debt. And Bard was very secure. He hated debt. He hated anything risking his credit, with banks. And Hardison disliked Bard, so a mutual animosity began. Stewart, who was more congenial, liked to get along with everybody, nevertheless had very opposing business views. Bard's faction was very tight. They hung together. They were composed primarily of relatives and local business cronies. So they always hung together, and they were kind of conniving, together to stick it to the Stewart Hardison group. Bard said, we don't need more property. I got more property, and I know what to do with. Don't buy any more. Stewart, he wanted to buy every piece of promising oil property in Southern California, and not necessarily from Bard, but anywhere he could find it. And they've been scouting everywhere for it, from Fullerton Field to Santa Maria to Santa Barbara to San Luis Obispo to Kern County. He wanted, to buy oil or buy land while it still could be bought, at relatively cheap prices. Bard believed that we should just be content with being an oil drilling company and a petroleum retailer. Sell it to the PCO, sell it to the standard for refining. Stewart wanted a diversified drilling, refining, petrochemical development, and marketing company. I don't need to draw the distinction so drastically because obviously they did compromise in some of these areas, but their instincts, were very opposed. Bard wanted to stay in Ventura County in the immediate region. Stewart, wanted Los Angeles, the Pacific Coast. He was even thinking of Indonesia and China, so he had global visions. Bard was very risk averse. Pay off debt, pay down debt. Maybe diversify outside of oil, getting into agriculture, walnuts, sugar beets, what have you. And Stewart said, we're an oil company. We want to be a completely integrated, diversified oil company. And the only way to do that is to take on risk. And so that's where the split, occurred. It was never resolved. Okay, for 10 years they fought. Hardison went off and grew lemons. Limonera, was founded with Blanchard. His grandnephew Charles Teague, which I think is kind of the father of Santa Paula, industry, founded Sunkist and Diamond Walnuts. And so over the decade, Hardison slowly withdrew and began selling out his interest in Union Oil. He went on, actually, he divorced his wife, moved to Pasadena, invested in real estate there. He went down to Peru looking for other ventures. He was a real character, and a real dynamic and charismatic person, who kind of was attracted, to possibilities. He even went into partnership with Union Oil enemies, while he was on the board of Union Oil. Secretly he'd be doing this. He bought the Herald Examiner newspaper, to compete with the LA Times. Ultimately, he got deeper and deeper into debt. He had to sell very valuable property in Pasadena that became the most exclusive, residential community in Pasadena several decades later. In 1909, at the age of 50, he was killed by an unscheduled railroad at a crossing in San Fernando. So he died at 59, young man. In the middle of the 1890s, Bard gave Stewart an ultimatum, either sell out or get out. Sell me your interest or, you buy me out. A very intense battle ensued for the next 5 years, 1894 to 1899. The Stewart family finally gained control in 1899. Union Oil becomes the largest in California. Bard buys a house in Los Angeles. He doesn't like Oxnard, being so successful and Hueneme, not gaining the stature that he thought it would. He felt it was better for his kids to be educated in LA than here in Ventura County. He's elected by the state legislature to fill a vacant U.S. Senate seat, and he served from 1900 to 1905. Bard was not reelected to a second term in 1904. He returned to Hueneme to build his Barrowwood estate in 1910 and developed the Hueneme and Ventura County until his death in 1915. Let me just close with reading a little statement that he sent to Lyman Stewart by telegram in 1904. He writes, I desire to thank you particularly for your cordial statement that the Union Oil Company stands solid for my re-election for Senate. I greatly appreciate your own friendly interest in the matter. It is particularly gratifying to me personally that the men with whom I've been associated in business, who know my shortcomings and defects of temperament, are able nevertheless to believe that I have the qualifications fitting me for such great responsibilities as the high office imposes upon me. Interesting to read into that, exactly where things finally stood between Bard and the Union Oil Company. That's it. Sorry I went so long.
I'd like to present you with a certificate of appreciation for speaking here at the museum.
Thank you.
And we'll schedule.
I love this museum,
Thank
so
you.
I'd love to come back
We
too.
love your wife too.
Good, yeah.
Thank
Well,
you.
thank you.
And,
Yeah, let me get the questions and answers.
Are you an oil man, a historian, or both?
No, I'm not an oil man. In fact, I'm more an economic historian and a religion historian. But I've had to learn oil because of Lyman Stewart. So I've learned oil history and oil technology from others. By reading, by visiting, by doing field visits and what have you. Are you an oil man? I'd love to meet you or talk to you if you are. So you can
I've
teach
always
me more.
had it. I an interest in many aspects of it. I read the history of Standard Oil, which is quite lengthy.
Right, Ida Tarbell. Yeah.
That is really something. Took me months to get through it. I read every word. And I developed a lot of questions. I'll just give you one. These men impress me. These oil men, coming from other countries also.
Yes.
Now, I've always wondered, where did they get the insight, the motivation, the inspiration, the education to be pointed in that direction? And like in your talk here, they just push, never just keep going. Now, I went to school, and about the only motivation I ever got was get into electronics and make big money. Well, I did, and that money never happened in a big way. So, how were these men stimulated or educated to go in that direction and see a mountain of sulfur and see an opportunity?
It's a marvelous question. Maybe I could give a whole talk, on this because it gets at the heart of why I study this. My feeling is faith in the Lyman Stewart. There definitely was he had a purpose in life, which was to, be a steward of, God's resources, and he ended up giving all of his wealth away. He didn't even give it to his kids. He gave it to missions overseas in China and Korea. He built the Bible Institute of Los Angeles and other things. Ambition on the part of others, is just, this driven success, to take risks and to, make it and to succeed. But for Stewart, once he became an oil man, which was kind of by accident, he didn't want to become an oil man. They just discovered oil, on his property. But once he became one, he said, that's all I know what to do, and I'm going to do it, to the best I can. I'm going to figure out this industry and how I can succeed despite everyone else's, failures. And he never gave up being an oil man.
So,
I think Carnegie, you know, he could do almost anything. You know, he was a railroad man, a telegraph man, you know, steel man. You know, he just was, a genius. You know, he was a Steve Jobs, you know, kind of guy. Carnegie was.
So that I get, might it have been divine providence?
Well, Stewart certainly thought it was. He felt, you know, God had put him in Titusville, Pennsylvania, you know, and had brought him out to California, you know, to be here on the West Coast and to build the Union Oil. And he definitely felt that was his mission. Did you have a question?
They started drilling here because of the seeps,
Yes.
but they had a good understanding of geology as to where to drill, like Eagle Canyon.
Well, you know, they didn't really know geology until Berkeley and Stanford started geology departments that were focused on what the geology of California was all about, because of all the faults, you know, and the special formations here in California. It's unique. So oil, petroleum geology was pioneered by people like William Orcutt, you know, of the Union Oil Company, and others, you know, who now they built models of what was underground. By when they pulled the stuff out from tailings, you know, they actually built models of what's down there, how deep. I didn't find any errors. I did find a few interesting things missing that I'll talk about. But if you want to learn more right away today, you can just go in that little room there and look at the exhibits. They're really good. Here are the three men I'm going to talk about today. Port Hueneme's founding father, Thomas Bard, from Pennsylvania. Lyman Stewart, also with Bard, a co-founder of the Union Oil Company, an oil man from western Pennsylvania. And Wallace Hardison, more businessman than an oil man, but he became one, and definitely a leading figure in Santa Paula history and the third co-founder of the Union Oil Company. All three of their pictures are over there in the room, so there's a lot of really close connections here with this place, this very place, which is cool. If you want to know more about Union Oil Company history, there are a lot of good books that have been written about it. The Union Oil Company itself has put out 2 corporate histories, which are quite good. The last one was published in 1990 on their centennial. You can still buy it at the Oil Museum in Santa Paula. And then Bard has his own 2-volume biography, Oil, Land, and Politics, The California Career of Thomas Robert Bard, by William Hutchinson, professor of history at Davis, Cal Davis. And it's a really very thorough, well-researched, intense study of Bard's life. There's a great first-hand memoir by an oil man, a real bona fide oil man from Pennsylvania and California, William Ewell, who wrote his memoir, 63 years in the oil fields, and he was on drilling rigs, so he was on the crews themselves, and probably drilled several thousand wells, you know, around here. So quite a storyteller. Gerald White wrote the Standard Oil Company of California's corporate history. Really exceptional job. He did a really balanced job, and not just tooting the horn of the ultimate winner of the oil contest in California, Standard Oil of California, Chevron today, but he gives very large treatment to our guys, you know, our Stewart, Hardison, and Bard and the Union Oil Company, which were their great rivals and for many decades even more powerful. And so he gives a very balanced treatment. And of course, there's more resources that are available. One of the things I really like about moving here to Port Hueneme in Ventura County is we're in the home country of the Union Oil Company, and we've got great archives and resources available. Finally, Larry mentioned that my wife and I both taught at Biola University, and It's in Los Angeles County. It's a large Christian university, about 8,000 students, 115 years ago, and it was founded by Lyman Stewart, the oilman, who was a very devout Presbyterian. He had been involved in the founding of Occidental College, but he felt it was going astray, departing from the faith, and he wanted to put a really faithful Christian school in the middle of Los Angeles. That's where the Bible Institute of Los Angeles began. And then Lyman Stewart's widow, his second wife, who's here, gave all of his papers to our archives, and I've spent most of the last 10 years, just poring over those. I've read through everything, that's on that table, at least once, maybe more. And as Larry mentioned, I'm writing a biography of Lyman Stewart. So this is where, a lot of our history is, and it's something I'm very happy to share with you guys today. I'm going to talk a little bit about each one of these characters, who were contemporaries of one another and whose lives intersected. I'm going to move chronologically, from their beginning to the end, but I'm going to be moving back and forth to tell their stories. I'm going to begin with Lyman Stewart. He was born first, 1840. There's a picture of him as a young man. He was a very devout, pious Presbyterian. The Scottish Covenanters, they were called, were a very devout group of religious folks who tended to live in enclaves in Pennsylvania when they came to America. And so he was one of those. They moved to rural western Pennsylvania. His father was a tanner, and very, very modest, poor means, but they homesteaded, they got land, and Lyman worked for his father, just horseback around the countryside, finding dead animals, and farmers would say, I got a dead cow, or I want to, skin a cow, and he'd come and get the hide, bring him to his dad. So he knew the whole area really well. In 1857, there was a revival, a religious revival going on before the Civil War, and it came to all the cities. You may not know about this, but Lyman experienced a very profound religious conversion at this time. And he said, he made a vow that he would become a missionary. But instead of that happening, the Civil War came upon him, and it kind of changed the direction of his life. Just before the Civil War, though, they discovered oil in the Titusville, Pennsylvania area. This is a region where there were oil seeps, just like ours here, and some of these early joint venture companies that were looking to figure out some useful purpose for this oil, medicine, lubricants, what have you. The big driver at the time was the fact that illumination in the home was done with whale oil lanterns. So it wasn't an energy source, it was a lighting source that they were looking for to replace whale oil. And they used pine tar, resins that made, what's the turpentine, which is flammable. In fact, that was a very big commodity for a little while. But then they discovered that rock oil, as it was called, could be distilled into a very good lighting fluid, and so that drew people to Titusville, and a professor at Yale, in order to help fund his laboratory, he counseled these investors in rock oil, and they hired him to go out and investigate and see what he could do in terms of distilling products from this material. And he wrote a business report, on rock oil. And they also gave him shares, in the company, so he would become, enriched, by the prospects, and paid him, for this very favorable report. And it caused, a big storm, a rush for oil in the area. And the guy who ultimately drilled the first oil well, Edwin Drake, who was a disabled railroad conductor, they hired him. He had some management skills, and he was a tall, very good-looking guy. And he came to Titusville, and he hired some salt well miners, who knew how to dig holes, not too deep, but just to get salt water out that they then distilled, into salt. He hired them, and they started boring holes in the ground. And it attracted more people who knew how to dig holes, and the technology for the oil industry, really began, there. This is all just before the Civil War. Lyman was, they were very strong abolitionists, so when it looked like the country's fate, was in trouble after the big battle of Antietam, Lincoln actually asked, for 200,000 volunteers for 3 years, which was a big, commitment to leave home for 3 years service to put an end to this rebellion. Lyman volunteered right after the Battle of Antietam, and he headed off to join the cavalry of the Army of the Potomac. He spent the next 3 years in all the major campaigns in Northern Virginia, Gettysburg, Chancellorsville, Fredericksburg, and he continued all the way up to Appomattox. Usually, living in the field in enemy country, so in rough, rugged conditions. Often the Union forces were surrounded by escaped slaves, who came to the Union forces for shelter. And so he had a very first-hand view, into the great social problems of the Negro race. As he called it, he became a very profound philanthropist, and helped start a Presbyterian college for black ministers. And he had a great sympathy for the veterans, of the Civil War. So he was a great friend of the veterans. He helped with the Soldiers' Home in LA, which was the largest soldiers' retirement home and hospital for Civil War veterans, out here in LA after the Civil War. Okay, jumping over to Bard. Bard was born a year later, about 150 miles east, toward Gettysburg, Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. And he also was from modest means and a Presbyterian, perhaps not as devout, but still, a believing Presbyterian. Both Stewart and Bard were teetotalers, so they were people of sincere convictions. The judge in Chambersburg, whose city was named after Judge Chambers, took Bard under his wing, tutored him in the law, and hoped that he would go off to Princeton, where all good Presbyterian, young men go. But he didn't want, to, be that serious, in his vocations. And he went into business working on the railroad, which was the big thing, at the time. And so he worked in, one of the smaller railroads that then got gobbled up into the Pennsylvania Railroad. And he was, is a very, well-liked, very, very professional. He's a big man, he had a good manner. He grew a mustache, to make him look more authoritative, because he was often asked to go collect, past due bills from farmers, who hadn't paid their freight and what have you. He did a good job at that, and apparently he developed a pretty gruff manner, later on in life. He was a tough customer. He then came to the attention of the head. He was really the vice president, but he really ran the Pennsylvania Railroad, Thomas Scott. He's also, back there if you want to read more about Scott. He was quite a capitalist railroad man. And Scott, ended up then sponsoring Bard, to be his man in California. We'll get to that story. There were reports that out here in the Ventura County area in the Santa Barbara Channel, there's oil seeps, both in the water and land. And Bard, who was a railman, said, we're building a transcontinental railroad, on the northern route. If we can do another one on the southern route, once the Civil War is over, we can, get a railroad down here in Southern California and get access to that oil. So that was his vision, building the southern route and also becoming a big California land baron. And so he sent a scouting party that included this Professor Silliman, who was the expert on petroleum. And they sent him out here, and he went by train and overland and stagecoach and then steamer. He steamed up here to Ventura County, and he actually saw the oil glistening in the ocean, and he claims he could smell the oil coming off under the ocean. Well, he tended to exaggerate a little bit, but he did get out, and he spent a week or two scouting around, and he ran into an oil man who was already here, an ex-whale oil distiller named George Gilbert. His picture's also in the, it's a very good story that's over there in that little room there about oil. And Gilbert had set up a still at one of the seeps, over, just south of Ojai, and he took Silliman on a tour of the Ojai Rancho and Sulphur Mountain. My wife and I just made a tour of Sulphur Mountain last weekend, to see what it's like. And, we noticed the oil seep that's right off of Route 150, it's right next to the road there. And, the mountain's it's not really a mountain, it's only 1,000 feet high, but it is a long 15-mile ridge, that was called Sulphur Mountain by the Spanish. Silliman then wrote up a report, of his findings, and he was pumped it up, California will be found to have more oil in its soil than all the whales in the Pacific Ocean. The oil is struggling to the surface at every available point, and it's running down the rivers for miles. And he was paid for this report, of course, and also got stock, in the company. And in fact, every one of the companies that were set up hired him, to produce their scientific assessment. And in his report, there's a map, of our area here, and a close-up of Sulphur Mountain, down here below. And so that's where Scott sent Bard. He said, go to Ventura County, get the land, obtain it, and examine it for oil potential. And so all these shaded segments, of Ventura County, or what was then Santa Barbara County, but is now Ventura County, were obtained by Scott, who had access, not only to wealth, being a railroad man, but banks, who would lend him the money. And so he had no problem, buying up this land for about 50 cents an acre. He set up two companies, the California Petroleum Company at Ojai, and the Philadelphia and California Petroleum Company in Simi, San Francisco counties, which is over in the Santa Clarita area, and the rancho that's in between. Silliman was again paid, to write reports for each of these different companies, and glowing reports, about their potential. And Bard was set out to work for the California Petroleum Company, at Ojai, under the superintendent, of the field. He's really ran the company, a fellow named William Stone. And Bard was given, because he had legal training, he was given the role of trustee, kind of his agent, to look out for things, as well as to learn the oil business, because he knew nothing about it. They hired another chemist, to do work on the oil that they were discovering, and this guy, Stephen Peckham, was a real scientist. He was at Brown University in Providence, and he later ended up being head of the chemistry department at Cal Berkeley, and ended up working for the Union Oil Company. But he came out here to see what he could do. He tried to make kerosene, out of the oil that was coming out. It was really poor oil, poor gravity, high sulfur, and very little kerosene could be derived from it. And he said, this is ridiculous. He said, unless we obtain, good supply of, good oil, we're not going to be able to do anything with this. And, they didn't know how to drill really deep back then, but they thought the stuff's flowing out of the ground. It's got to be, easy to get to, but They went down several hundred feet, you know, in many places using, you know, the adequate technology for the time. But they just kept coming up with dry holes. The Philadelphia and California Petroleum Company was a total failure. They shut down. The Ojai company that Bard worked for, they were more deliberate, you know, more organized in what they were doing, and they did drill 7 wells, set up camps all around Sulphur Mountain, you know, one at a time, move on to the next. But by the time they got done, a couple years of work here, the shareholders and Scott decided to close down, you know, the whole operation. They spent over $1 million, which was like $50 million in those days, and they had like $10,000 worth of bad oil, you know, to show for it. Here's where Bard drilled the wells. The first one, number 1 down there, is where Bard built his first home. You know, it's just near, what is it, Casitas Springs or something like, you know, right
Yes.
near there? Yeah, and where the San Antonio Creek comes into the Ventura River. You know, right there was where the
Gotcha.
first one was built. Arnez Ranch or something, I think it's called now. They built another one at Camp Comfort, you know, just south of Ojai, and then kept going around, you know, looking, you know, for seeps and good area to drill. Finally, the last one, number 6 down there, which is just about a mile before you get to St. Thomas Aquinas College, you know, right off the road. They did drill a deep enough well to where, you know, they were producing a steady stream, and there's a marker there right now if you pull off the side of the road there, and it's called Ojai number 6, and it I think it says the first commercial oil well, you know, in California. Well, there's lots of disputes, you know. It wasn't really commercial if it was shut down, you know, and it never really, you know, was able to produce, you know, a business, you know, from it. But it was a success, at least demonstrated there was better oil deeper, you know, if you could get to it. There were other early oil pioneers. How am I doing on time?
Good.
Okay, is this moving fast enough or slow enough?
This is good.
Okay.
We'll keep you.
The Stanford brothers came down here too. I didn't realize that there were like 8 Stanford brothers, you know. And Leland, you know, the one most famous, the senator and the founder of Stanford University, the railroad man, he was the youngest. So his older brothers were in all sorts of lumber and mining, gold mining, you know, other ventures, and they came down here at the same time to see if they could dig for oil. And they were good at digging tunnels since they had been gold miners, and also were digging tunnels on the railroads, you know, and they had Chinese laborers. So they brought Chinese laborers in to dig tunnels in Sulphur Mountain, but it also, you know, just trickles of stuff, you know, were coming out. And they did build, you know, quite a few tunnels. They went deep into debt, and Brother Leland ultimately bailed his brothers out, and you know, they left town. So the first oil rush, you know, was a bust, you know, here in Ventura County. The chemist Peckham, who'd been hired, you know, to evaluate things, he accused Silliman, the guy who started all this with his false reports, of fraud, and actually wrote an article in the Scientific Journal, you know, accused. Yes.
Were those tunnels vertical mine shafts?
Those tunnels went up in an incline, and once they hit some seam, you know, of oil-bearing rock, it would, by gravity, you know, go down. And they dug like a shallow ditch, you know. So the tunnel was actually using gravity to get at oil that was above. Okay, instead of digging down, you're digging up, because the faults around here, you know, had some of these oil-bearing layers, you know, at an upward incline. So if you could tunnel into them and hit them, you know, it would. Is that making sense?
How
You know?
deep? How deep did it go?
You know, I think I have a picture. I'll get to one later, 900 feet,
So there's a bunch,
1,000 feet.
there's a bunch of tunnels in Sulphur Mountain?
Still, yeah. Some of them are open, you can actually go into, but they're in private property that's closed off, so. Probably 30 tunnels. Peckham, he actually, to protect his professional reputation and the science of petroleum chemistry, took Silliman to task and accused him of spiking his samples, either with better quality Pennsylvania oil or even just pouring kerosene into this stuff. All right, that was Bard's story. Back to Lyman Stewart. Lyman Stewart, after the Civil War, comes back to Titusville, and the oil boom is really moving, in Titusville, Pennsylvania. And so he gets into it because he knows the land, he has connections, and even though he's a very poor, man, and also not in good health, he spent a good deal of his time in military hospitals near death, not from wounds, but from the kind of thing that most people died in the Civil War, typhoid fever and malaria, dysentery, so he was very weak. But that's a great picture of him, as a young oil man in Titusville. And he was very successful. He was respected, he was knowledgeable, he was ingenious, he invented new tools, and he went to business school and learned accounting and finance, so he was able to get loans and put together, structure, partnerships. He made a fortune by 1870. Fortunately, had some good drillers, working with better equipment, and they had some big strikes. He decided that the business was getting oversupplied and oversaturated, and there wasn't much you could do with oil. And he said, I'm going to get into farm equipment. And so he went and tried to start a factory to produce automated farm harvest equipment. He just wasn't good enough to beat McCormick, at it. And in fact, there was a depression in 1873 that was very severe, and a lot of farms went out of business, banks failed, and Lyman's factory failed. So the money he made, quickly in oil, he lost completely. He then had a fire, that destroyed his factory and his office. It destroyed all his letters and records and business records, and people claimed that he owed them money for decades because he didn't have the records to prove it, that he had paid them or didn't owe them. But he was very morally conscientious, and he would review any claim that people made against him because he had to declare bankruptcy, to whether he had a moral obligation, to pay off some creditor. Out of luck, but still very well respected, he ran into his old friends, that he had sold his old oil partnerships to, James and Harvey Hardison, who were still in the oil business, and they were making a living, and they said, come on back and join us, and we'll get into the oil partnership again, which he did. So he struggled, to pick himself up and move forward. But by this time, the oil industry in Titusville is very saturated, very competitive. The Rockefellers had moved in and monopolized the refining business, and it was really tough, to make it big. And so his brother Milton, who was also an oil man, and I was going to talk a little bit about technology. I've got time to do that. And this is interesting, because oil prices dropped so tremendously because of production without much demand. People didn't know what to do with all this oil. They had to make the drilling much more efficient and less costly to drill wells, and so they improved their technology very rapidly in order to reduce cost. And so the derricks got bigger and bigger, and they started dropping big pipe casings down into the hole to protect the hole from being flooded with water or collapsing, which is, you know, most of the wells were failures. They spent a lot of money digging a very deep hole and got nothing. So if you wanted to make money in oil, you had to have success. You know? So drilling with better technology, better equipment, and more successfully and deeper was how you would survive. On the refining and transportation side, the Rockefeller, who was an accountant, you know, he knew, you know, how to reduce cost, you know, in the refining process and get more out of the refining process, and he perfected it, and he built big refineries in Cleveland and Pittsburgh and the Ohio Valley, and he was able to take all the supply that his refineries, you know, had all the capacity, and so all the other refiners went out of business. He also monopolized the transportation. Instead of bringing oil in barrels, you know, on wagons, you know, they started bringing tanker cars and then pipelines to storage tankers. And all of this happened really quick, you know. It's really quite an amazing, you know, dynamic. This is where Wallace Hardison comes in. Wallace was the youngest of 11 children. His older brothers had been working, partnering with Lyman Stewart, you know, as they attempted to recover, you know, their oil business. They invited younger brother Wallace to join in, and Wallace was this big younger brother with a great personality, you know, and he just commanded attention when he came into a room. And he quickly took over any partnership that he was a part of. You know, he just had that magnetism, almost bewitching. And so very quickly he became very prominent, you know, within their partnership and within the industry. You know, and he also, like everyone else, you know, wanted to move on, you know, to greener pastures, buy land in the West, become a big rancher, you know, whatever it was that people had as their end goal at the time. He wanted to do. He went to Kansas. He ended up realizing that was a mistake. You know, it wasn't going to be, you know, the pot of gold that he thought. And but he did that. He went to Kansas, and Stewart, you know, said, "I'm going to go to California. You know, I think we can make money in the oil business there. At least I've heard we can." Okay. Back in California, you know, the first phase had been a failure. Stanford's left, Bard operation shut down, but a few oil pioneers continued to hang on, especially over in Pico Canyon in Santa Clarita Valley area. There was a fellow named Alexander Mentry, who some people will say is the, you know, kind of father of, you know, the commercial oil industry in California. He was a real oil veteran. He knew how to drill a hole, and he came to Pico Canyon, and he brought, you know, some good talent, and they started drilling some successful wells, you know, pretty deep ones. They formed a company called the Star Oil Works, and another oilman, Demetrius Schofield, who then became very prominent in the future decades as the head of Standard Oil of California, went to San Francisco, lined up investors, you know, some big honchos up in San Francisco, and said, we can get a successful refinery and oil operation going in Pico Canyon. So during this period, 1876 was kind of their great success, the first commercially successful oil well in California. There's still a, you know, plaque up there today. And in fact, there's a historical site, Mentryville, if you are able to visit. It's really quite interesting. You know, it's a very beautiful setting where all of this happened. And that oil well continued to produce for over 100 years. So it's, you know, was really quite a success. That truly is the first commercially successful oil well in California. The backers of the operation from San Francisco that came in to kind of capitalize and expand the Star Oil Works was called Pacific Coast Oil Company, the PCO. They are the originators progenitors of the Standard Oil Company. And so these men from San Francisco, Demetrius Schofield, Charles Felton. Felton was the head of the bank of the Mint in San Francisco, and a senator. He became a senator, U.S. senator. And Lloyd Tevis, who's head of Wells Fargo, and in Ewell, the driller, was their superintendent, working with Mentry. This was a good team. They put together, money, political clout, and oil talent to form the Pacific Coast Oil Company. And they started recruiting other oilmen, from Pennsylvania to come out here to Pico Canyon. We got a good thing going. This is how, look, before I jump ahead, Bard stays here in California. The rest of the Scott team, went back east. Bard stayed here. He was a trustee for all the lands that Scott had acquired. And instead of focusing on oil, he focused on, completing, the development, of the properties of Scott. He envisioned the port here at Hueneme. He formed a company to build the wharf and the lighthouse, which was built in 71, the lighthouse in 74, and he moved from Ojai to Hueneme at this time. He built, we had a really nice talk on the history of the port and the wharf a couple of months ago. I won't talk further about that. Scott, the railroad man, he still had a dream of building a railroad, out here to the south. He tried to get it through Congress. He paid $300,000 to the Republican Party and the Democratic Party in the election of 1876, which many of you know was a very close election, that was contested. Hayes, the Republican, lost the popular vote, but had the lead in the Electoral College, and Tilden, the Democrat, had the popular vote. And Scott, had paid off both of them, no matter who won, and it's just give me the southern route, And Scott had bought a Texas railroad company that he was going to build from El Paso to San Diego. That was his dream. However, he even got Hayes engineered. There was this deal, that the Republicans would call off the Reconstruction in the South, and Hayes, a Republican, would become president, and he traveled to Washington in Scott's railroad car. But he was outmaneuvered by Jay Gould, Union Pacific, Missouri Pacific, and Collis Huntington, Southern Pacific. Huntington was living in Washington, D.C. throughout the 70s, just to lobby Congress and make sure that the Southern Pacific, Central Pacific interests, had maintained a complete hold on California. And so Scott died in 1882, his vision, in disarray. Bard, as his trustee, handled the probate of his estate for several years. It's a very complex estate probate. He began auctioning land in 1888, and that's when most of the maps, of all these little communities here, like the maps we have here, we've got a Simi map and a Satapoy map and a Hueneme map, are all part of the Bard estate that was surveyed in 1888 and parceled out for sale. We're right on this little map here, and it goes right up to Scott Boulevard, 2 blocks up, which is named after Scott. Maybe it's Scott Street or Scott Street, not Boulevard. Okay. Isaac Blake, another very famous oilman, was a recruiter for this Pacific Coast Oil Company that had been set up in Pico Canyon. And he went back to Titusville looking for oilmen, who would come out and work for the PCO or joint venture with them. And he contacted Lyman Stewart, who had an excellent reputation, and said, you know, you should bring your operations out here to California. And so this is when Lyman liquidated his interests, you know, what he had at the time, his home. He sold his furniture, he sold his house, he sold everything. And 140,000 of the combined interest in this Stewart-Hardison partnership were split. Hardison took 70 and went to Kansas. Stewart took 70,000 and went to California. And Stewart writes in his journal, with 70,000 and my Bible, you know, I go out to California to scout for opportunities. And he traveled all the area on horseback with Blake, who showed him, you know, the ex-mission area, Sulphur Mountain, Sespe, and he was very enthused by what he saw. And so he contacted Hardison back in Kansas and said, you know, don't stay in Kansas, come out here. You know, and Hardison had decided that he wasn't going to stay in Kansas, and it sounded like a good deal to him. So he comes out here and looks around, and he brings John Irwin, a Stewart nephew, who's a great driller and you know, and scout, you know, of prospects. And they say, you know, this is going to work. Let's do it. And they formed the Hardison Stewart and Company partnership. And they hire a drilling crew, 35 men, to come out from Titusville, you know, which is a big deal. You know, to come out in California, 6-month project. They paid them half in advance and half at the end. You know, and John Irwin is circled there in the middle, the man, you know, with a long beard. And these were very skilled oil. And right away they got to drilling deep holes in Pico Canyon. And the equipment they brought out was state of the art, big, heavy, you know, 1-ton, you know, drilling balers, very heavy drill bits, you know. And you know, they brought out steam engines, you know, all the equipment they need. Question?
Were they all still impact?
Yep, you can see a bit, you know, down there. They just, you know, they drop a bit, you know, crush the stone, they pull the bit out, and then they put this baler down to pack up, you know, the tailings. They haul it out, you know. They sometimes wash it out with water, you know, and pump it out. You know, they just drilled the hole deeper, deeper, deeper. Drill is not the right word, because they weren't drills, you know, it was called making hole, you know. You pounded a hole.
When did they switch to rotary?
You know, they didn't really until about 1915 or so, you know, find that really the Texas, Oklahoma oil fields, you know, were where the rotary drill, you know, technology began to predominate, and then it moved over here. The PCO, you know, who had invited Hardison and Stewart out here, gave them leases. You know, here you can lease on you can drill on our leases. If you are successful, you know, we'll split the cost and the profits with you. If you are not successful, it's your tough luck. You know, you bear the cost. So it was a hard bargain, you know. But these guys were confident in their skill that they were going to, you know, hit oil. Well, they drilled 5 deep, empty holes in the ground, and they spent all their money and didn't hit any oil. And it was heartbreaking, you know, because Stewart had just put everything into this, and Hardison had too. And they got other friends from Titusville, you know, to invest in this. So they asked PCO, you know, for a break. You know, give us a break. You know, give us a good lease. You know, where we're going to find some oil, because otherwise we're going to have to send these guys back. You know, and I don't even have enough to pay them. You know, what we owe them. And so this, you know, one of the great moments in oil history in California, on this little ridge in Pico Canyon, they are given a lease on the top of the hill, very hard to get to. You know, it was not any favor PCO did, but fortunately it was in an area that they thought they'd find oil, and they did. And they had to dig 1,600 feet. They hit oil. It was enough, to pay off their men, and but they had to sell it, just to move on. And so they scrambled. There's a little picture of Mentryville, Pico Canyon, if you want to go visit. There's a historical site there, and the hill is, just above the Mentryville titling there. That hill, they called it Christian Hill because Lyman Stewart would not allow any cursing, by the oil crews on the hill. And all the men, that were there, were good Christian, Pennsylvanians, and so they had a dry town, with no taverns, no gambling halls, no prostitution or anything. It was like a little pristine community. They had a pastor who would come in every Sunday, and preach from the front steps of the bunkhouse, and so it made quite an impact, on oil industry when the pious Bible packing Lyman Stewart, brought his operation. All right, now let me think about how I can wrap things up, because I haven't really been able to get to the main point, which is how did all this come together with these guys? Can I go a little bit over? Is that
Yes,
okay with
fine.
you folks? Okay. Okay, thank you. The PCO guys, these Sharpies, Tevis and Felton, the rich guys up in San Francisco, they kept changing the terms of these leases, and they kept, one guy would sign them, but say, oh, well, then the partner has to sign them before they're effective. And they really got strung along, this whole time, and basically figured out the PCO was using their drilling crew and their money, to scout out for oil prospects at no cost and no risk to them. And Milton, Lyman's brother, who stayed back in Titusville, wrote to Lyman in 1884 saying, I advise you to keep your eyes wide open for that man Felton. When I saw him here a year ago, I set him down as a sharper of the first water, and you will so surely find him out if you are not cautious. I tried to figure out what sharper of the first water meant, and apparently back in those days, bathtubs were used by many people, one right after another. They didn't throw the water and change it every time. And so whoever got in the first water, was primo. The first water was the highest quality. So he was a high quality sharper, is what he was. So
What's a sharper?
a sharper must be, someone with very sharp business practices,
A shark?
Yeah, a shark, a snake,
Okay.
Lyman wrote back, the facts are we have got completely fooled. First, in the character of the territory. Second, by the character of the parties we are dealing with. Scoundrels. There's now a struggle between PCO and Union Oil, what becomes Union Oil, and then became Standard Oil and Union Oil, that goes on from this time. It goes way back, to the very beginning. Lyman, some of these letters that Lyman wrote that are in the archives that I've poured through, he wrote back to his pastor, just saying, how distressed he was. He writes here, for a long time the wells failed us, but when we finally began to have some success, the men in whom we trusted failed us. And this latter failure hurts us more than did the former. I'm so heartsick and weary with this perplexing business that it seems I could not endure the strain for a single day, were it not that I, in my sheer helplessness, am impelled from time to time to flee from my work and call upon my dear Heavenly Father for His sustaining grace. Business is now a great burden, but I try to lay it upon the great burden bearer. How precious He is to me in these days of perplexity. How much I need your prayers, my dear brother, that I may be guided aright and sustained through all that is before me. This tells you a lot about Lyman's character. He's a very sincere, devout, pious man, undergoing tremendous strain and difficulty. but maintains, he's a real thing. In fact, he wrote back to his brother a little while later, "The Lord in his mercy has removed the cloud that seemed so impenetrable. Thanks and praise to his name. And I hope and pray that I may not forget the lesson, that I may not slight the teachings of his word." Lyman actually thought, that God was teaching him a lesson, through all of this. He didn't want him to succeed because God wanted him to depend on him more and to be more